We think we know the story. A scorned king, a faithless queen, and the swift, clean swing of a sword. History has softened the execution of Anne Boleyn, polishing it into a tragic but dignified final act, a somber scene fit for a Hollywood drama. But this is a lie, a carefully constructed piece of political theater designed to mask a reality far more savage, a psychological dismantling so complete and methodical that it should haunt the conscience of the modern world. The truth of Anne Boleyn's final days is not found in the noble swing of a blade, but in the calculated terror that preceded it. It is a story of state-sanctioned gaslighting, of a woman systematically unmade, her identity erased, her sanity questioned, and her death transformed into the ultimate spectacle of a tyrant's absolute power. What really happened on Tower Green in May of 1536 was not an execution. It was the culmination of a character assassination so profound. It sought to kill her soul long before the swordsman from Calais ever touched her neck. To look upon the face of Anne's death is to stare into the cold, reptilian eyes of a state that had perfected the art of destroying a human being from the inside out. This is not the story you remember. This is the story that will leave a permanent stain on your understanding of power, justice, and the terrifying fragility of truth itself. The stage for this horror was set not in the executioner's yard, but in the birthing chamber. Anne Boleyn's catastrophic failure was not one of fidelity, but of biology. She had promised King Henry VIII a son, an heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, and for that promise, Henry had torn his kingdom apart. He had broken with the Roman Catholic Church, a schism that sent shockwaves across Europe, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and cast aside a queen of 24 years, the devout and beloved Catherine of Aragon. Anne was the revolution made flesh. She was not merely a new wife. She was the symbol of a new era, a woman whose intelligence, ambition, and reformist faith had made her a queen. But her power, and indeed her life, rested on a single precarious condition: the successful delivery of a male child. In September 1533, she gave birth not to a prince, but to a girl, Elizabeth. While a healthy child, her gender was a profound disappointment, a first crack in the foundation of her reign. Still, there was hope. But a series of subsequent miscarriages began to erode Henry's patience, replacing his feigned passion with a cold, simmering resentment. The final fatal blow came in January 1536. On the very day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, Anne miscarried again. And when the terrified midwives unwrapped the bloody cloths, they found the unmistakable form of a male fetus. The news sent Henry into a private, terrifying rage. In his mind, twisted by ego and religious superstition, this was not a biological tragedy. It was a judgment from God. He had defied the Pope. He had remade his kingdom, and this woman, this witch, was cursed. Her womb was barren of legitimate sons, a sign that their union was an offense in the eyes of heaven. His love, a notoriously volatile and possessive force, curdled instantly into a homicidal hatred. He declared he was bewitched into marrying her. From that moment, Anne Boleyn was a dead woman walking. She was no longer a queen. She was a political problem, a theological embarrassment that needed to be erased. The machinery of the state, which she had helped to build, now turned its cold, inexorable gaze upon her, not to protect her, but to annihilate her. The architect of this annihilation was a man whose name has become synonymous with ruthless, bureaucratic evil: Thomas Cromwell. The low-born blacksmith's son, who had risen to become the king's chief minister, was a master of political pragmatism, a man who saw the world not in terms of morality, but of efficiency. He had been one of Anne's key allies in the early days of the Reformation, but Cromwell's ultimate loyalty was not to a person or a cause. It was to the power of the state, embodied by the king. He saw Anne's fall from favor not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The queen and her conservative, aristocratic faction stood in the way of the further religious and administrative reforms he planned, particularly the lucrative dissolution of the monasteries. With Anne out of the way, he could please the king who was already besotted with the demure and pliable Jane Seymour. And he could consolidate his own power, removing his political rivals in one swift, brilliant, and bloody purge. Cromwell's genius lay in his understanding that, to simply discard Anne through another divorce would be politically messy and would call into question the legitimacy of the king's break with Rome and the authority of his new church. It would make Henry look like a fool, manipulated by a succession of women. A more permanent and politically useful solution was required. Anne could not just be divorced. She had to be destroyed. Her character had to be so thoroughly blackened, her crimes so monstrous, that her execution would seem not like the act of a tyrant, but a regrettable necessity, a righteous cleansing of the court. He began to build his case with the cold precision of a master craftsman. He activated his vast network of spies, informants, and interrogators, turning the vibrant, gossipy world of the royal court into a web of fear and suspicion. Every flirtatious word, every casual gift, every private conversation was now scrutinized, twisted, and reinterpreted through a lens of treasonous intent. Cromwell was not investigating a crime. He was creating one, weaving a tapestry of lies so vast and so intricate that it would be impossible for his victim to unpick. He was about to unleash a campaign of psychological terror that would make the Tower of London seem a mercy. The first thread in Cromwell's web was a young court musician named Mark Smeaton. Of all the men who would be accused, Smeaton was the only one not of noble birth, making him the most vulnerable, the perfect starting point. He was a handsome, ambitious young man who had caught the Queen's eye with his musical talent. On April 30th, 1536, he was arrested and taken to Cromwell's house in Stepney for interrogation. What happened within those walls is a dark testament to Cromwell's methods. Smeaton was almost certainly tortured. While the official records are silent, the Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapais, a man with his own network of spies, reported that Smeaton was subjected to torments so severe that he confessed to whatever Cromwell demanded. He was likely put in the Tower's infamous manacles or subjected to a preliminary stretching on the rack. Under the duress of unimaginable pain and the promise of a lesser punishment, the young musician broke. He confessed to being the Queen's lover. This confession, extracted by agony, was the cornerstone of Cromwell's entire case. It was a lie, but it was a documented lie, a legal fiction that gave him the leverage he needed to proceed. With Smeaton's confession secured, the net began to close with terrifying speed. The very next day, May 1st, was the annual May Day joust at Greenwich Palace, a great spectacle of courtly pageantry. The king and queen sat together in the royal box, the picture of regal unity. But it was a facade, a final, cruel piece of theater orchestrated by Henry. In the middle of the tournament, the king was handed a message. His demeanor darkened instantly. He rose abruptly, taking a small group of his closest companions with him, and left without a word to his wife. Anne, left alone and publicly humiliated in the royal box, knew in that instant that something was terribly wrong. The public snub was a clear signal to the entire court. The Queen's power was gone. Her protector had abandoned her. The pack of wolves, led by Cromwell, was now free to move in for the kill. The king's departure was the signal. The accusations, once whispered in secret, could now be brought into the open. The trap, so carefully set, was about to be sprung. The day after the joust, the arrests began in earnest. The first to be taken was Sir Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool, one of Henry's oldest and closest friends. The charge was that he had been the Queen's lover. Norris vehemently denied the accusation, but his word meant nothing. The king himself had interrogated Norris on the ride back from Greenwich, offering him a pardon if he would confess. Norris refused, maintaining both his own and the Queen's innocence, a final, brave act of loyalty that sealed his fate. Next came Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton, two other prominent gentlemen of the Privy Chamber. The web was expanding, pulling in men from the very heart of the king's inner circle. This was not just an attack on Anne. It was a political purge, a systematic elimination of a court faction that Cromwell and the Seymours perceived as a threat. The charges were a grotesque tapestry of fabricated details, listing specific dates and places where the adulterous acts had allegedly occurred, all designed to give the illusion of a thorough investigation. Then came the ultimate blow, the accusation so vile, so unnatural, that it was designed to strip Anne of her very humanity in the eyes of the public. The charge of incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. George was a brilliant, witty, and reformist-minded nobleman, his sister's closest confidant. Their bond was one of intellectual and political alliance, but Cromwell's machine twisted it into something monstrous. The primary evidence for this charge came from George's own wife, Lady Rochford, a woman who despised her husband and her sister-in-law. She provided Cromwell with twisted snippets of court gossip and ambiguous conversations, which he then wove into a narrative of incestuous conspiracy. The charge was a masterstroke of black propaganda. Adultery was a sin, but incest was a crime against God and nature, a taint so profound that it would justify any punishment, no matter how extreme. On May 2, 1536, Anne herself was summoned before a council of nobles, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. She arrived expecting to discuss a political matter, but was instead presented with the lurid, impossible charges against her. She reacted with stunned disbelief, which her accusers interpreted as the cunning of a guilty woman. Her protestations of innocence were ignored. She was formally arrested and informed that she would be taken to the Tower of London. The journey was not made in secret, but in a public procession down the Thames, a deliberate act of humiliation. As her barge approached the fortress, she saw that she was not being taken to the royal apartments, where she had prepared for her coronation just 3 years earlier. She was being taken to the entrance reserved for the most notorious enemies of the state, the traitor's gate. As she passed through that dark, watery archway, the full horror of her situation must have descended upon her. This was the place from which few returned. The stones themselves seemed to whisper of death and despair. When the constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, met her, she reportedly fell to her knees, laughing and weeping in a state of near hysteria, asking, "Shall I go to a dungeon?" "No, madam," Kingston replied. "You shall go to your lodging that you lay in at your coronation." The cruelty of this detail is breathtaking. She was to be imprisoned in the very rooms that had symbolized her greatest triumph, a constant, tormenting reminder of how far and how fast she had fallen. It was a psychological torture worthy of the most depraved minds. Her imprisonment in the Tower was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She was under constant surveillance, her every word and action recorded by the constable, William Kingston, in detailed reports sent directly to Cromwell. Her ladies-in-waiting were not her own trusted servants. At least 2 of them were spies, placed in her chambers to engage her in conversation, to offer false sympathy, and to report any incriminating statements she might make in her distress. Anne, trapped in a whirlwind of fear and confusion, swung wildly between moments of defiant anger, hysterical laughter, and profound, weeping despair. She talked incessantly, her mind racing as she tried to understand the nightmare that had engulfed her. She would recall innocent conversations, moments of courtly flirtation, and try to piece together how these harmless events could have been so monstrously twisted. "I am the king's true wedded wife," she would insist, then moments later, she would despair. "I shall die without justice." Her conversations were a stream of consciousness, a desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. She spoke of Mark Smeaton, the musician, admitting she had once chided him for his social ambition. She spoke of Henry Norris, recalling a light-hearted, flirtatious conversation about him wanting to marry her if the king were dead. In a sane world, these were the trivialities of court life. In Cromwell's hands, they became proof of her treasonous intent. The spies listening to her ramblings carefully noted every word, stripping them of context and presenting them to Cromwell as further confessions. Anne was, in effect, providing the rope to hang herself, her own panicked words being used to tighten the noose. The psychological pressure was immense. She was isolated from all legal counsel and from her family. She was living in a bubble of paranoia, where the faces of her attendants, meant to be a source of comfort, were now masks for her enemies. She would alternate between preparing for her defense, convinced of her ability to prove her innocence, and preparing for her death, convinced that the outcome was already decided. At one point, she famously remarked to Kingston that she would have no trouble dying, as she had a little neck. This moment of gallows humor, so often cited, was not a sign of courage, but a symptom of a mind fracturing under unbearable stress, a form of dissociation from the horror of her reality. During this time, she was also subjected to interrogations by Cromwell and other counselors. They would visit her in her chambers, pressing her for a confession, offering her the king's mercy if she would admit her guilt. The offer of mercy was a lie, a psychological tool designed to break her resolve. If she confessed, it would validate the king's actions. If she refused, she would be branded as stubborn and unrepentant. She was trapped in a perfectly designed legal and psychological cage, a maze with no exit. Her defiance in the face of this onslaught is a testament to her extraordinary spirit, but it was a defiance that could not alter the predetermined outcome. The state had already decided her fate. The imprisonment was merely the prelude, a period of psychological softening before the final public act of destruction. The trial of the accused men, which took place on May 12th, was a legal travesty. Norris, Weston, and Brereton pleaded not guilty, maintaining their honor and the Queen's innocence to the last. Only Mark Smeaton, the musician, broken by torture and clinging to a false hope of mercy, pleaded guilty. The verdict for all of them was never in doubt. They were found guilty of treason and condemned to the full, horrific punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The trial of Anne and her brother George followed on May 15th, held in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. It was the greatest state trial of the century, a piece of high political theater presided over by their own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who sat as Lord High Steward. Around 26 other peers formed the jury, their faces a gallery of political enemies and men too terrified of the king to vote their conscience. Anne was brought before this hostile court, a lone woman surrounded by the combined power of the English state. Contemporary accounts, even those from her enemies like the imperial ambassador Chapais, noted her extraordinary composure. She was not hysterical or weeping, but calm, dignified, and intelligent. She listened to the long, lurid list of charges against her, and responded to each one with clarity and wit, creating a marvelous impression on the spectators. She exposed the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, and eloquently defended her honor. But it was a futile performance. The verdict had been decided before the trial even began. When the jury of her peers was asked for their verdict, each one, starting with the lowest in rank, placed his hand on his heart and declared her guilty. The Duke of Norfolk, his face reportedly wet with tears as he condemned his own niece, sentenced her to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Anne received the sentence with unshakable calm. She raised her eyes to heaven and made a powerful final speech to the court, not begging for her life, but defending her honor and her immortal soul. She maintained her innocence, forgave her judges for their unjust verdict, and prayed for the king. It was a performance of such regal dignity that it silenced the hall. She had lost the trial, but in the eyes of many who watched, she had won a profound moral victory. George Bullen's trial followed immediately. Like his sister, he He defended himself with courage and intelligence, but he, too, was condemned. The fall of the House of Boleyn was complete. In the days that followed, the final humiliations were piled on. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a man who owed his career to Anne, was sent to her in the Tower. Under immense pressure from Cromwell, he was there to extract one final concession. He declared her marriage to Henry null and void on the dubious grounds of Henry's previous affair with her sister, Mary. By forcing her to agree to this, the state achieved its final objective. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was now officially declared a bastard, removed from the line of succession. Anne was not just an adulterous queen to be executed. She was a woman who had never been queen at all. Her entire reign, her revolution, erased with the stroke of a pen. It was the ultimate act of psychological and political annihilation. The execution of the 5 condemned men took place on May 17th on Tower Hill. Henry, in a small act of mercy that served only to expedite the process, commuted their sentences from the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering to a simple beheading. George Boleyn, on the scaffold, gave a moving speech admitting he was a sinner, but never admitting to the specific crimes for which he was condemned, a subtle but clear final protestation of his innocence. The others followed, each meeting their end with a courage that impressed the crowd. Mark Smeaton, in his final moments, broken and terrified, would only say, "Masters, I pray you all pray for me, for I have deserved the death." A tragically ambiguous statement that could be interpreted as a confession of his alleged sins, or simply an admission of his own folly in the treacherous world of the court. His death served its purpose. His confession was sealed, the official narrative cemented. For Anne, a different fate was planned. Henry had decided that she would not be burned as a witch, but beheaded. And in a final, bizarre twist, he decreed that she would not be killed with the common English executioner's axe, a brutal and often clumsy instrument that could take multiple blows. Instead, he sent for an expert swordsman from Calais, a French territory then under English control. This act has often been misinterpreted as a gesture of compassion, a final act of mercy for the woman he once loved. This is a naive and sentimental reading. The choice of the sword was about control, precision, and theater. An execution by sword was a rare and sophisticated spectacle in England. It required immense skill and a different upright kneeling posture from the victim, rather than the prostrate position on a block. Henry, the ultimate showman, was stage managing every last detail of his wife's destruction. He wanted a clean, perfect, and unforgettable performance. He was not granting mercy. He was commissioning a masterpiece of state-sanctioned death. The swordsman's arrival was delayed, and Anne's execution, scheduled for May 18th, had to be postponed by a day. This delay was its own form of torture. Anne had prepared herself for death. She had taken her final sacrament and made her peace with God. Now, she was forced to endure another 24 hours in the suffocating limbo between life and death. Sir William Kingston reported that she was in a state of calm, almost cheerful resignation. She told him she had heard the executioner was very good, and that she had a little neck, and laughed. This was not cheerfulness. It was the final, dissociative stage of psychological trauma. A mind that had retreated so far from an unbearable reality that it could only observe its own destruction with a detached, otherworldly calm. This waiting was the final turn of the screw in Cromwell's carefully calibrated machine of torment. The morning of May 19, 1536, dawned gray and damp. Anne's execution was to be a private affair, held within the walls of the Tower on Tower Green, rather than on the public scaffold on Tower Hill. But private was a relative term. A crowd of around 1,000 spectators, councillors, courtiers, and the Lord Mayor of London had been invited to witness the event. This was not an act of decency to spare her a public mob. It was a demonstration of power for the political elite, a final, chilling warning to anyone who might consider defying the king. Dressed in a dark gray damask gown trimmed with ermine, a symbol of royalty, she was still defiantly claiming, and a red kirtle underneath, the color of Catholic martyrdom. She walked with composure from her lodgings to the newly erected scaffold. She was not weeping or hysterical. Her ladies followed, their faces streaked with tears. On the scaffold, she saw the French swordsman, a burly, anonymous figure clad in black, his great two-handed executioner's sword laid nearby, concealed in straw. She turned to the assembled crowd and delivered her final masterful speech. It was not a confession. It was a carefully worded statement of submission to the law, a plea for the public to think the best of the king, and a commendation of her soul to God. "I am come hither to die," she said, "for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." She did not admit guilt, but she did not challenge the verdict, a subtle distinction that protected her from being accused of treason in her final moments. She praised the king as a most merciful and gentle prince, a statement of such profound, bitter irony that it can only be understood as a final, desperate attempt to protect her daughter Elizabeth from his wrath. She asked the people to pray for her, and with that, she prepared for the end. She removed her headdress, tucking her hair into a cap. One of her weeping ladies came forward to blindfold her. The use of a blindfold, again, was not mercy. It was a practical measure to prevent the victim from flinching at the sight of the blade and botching the execution. Kneeling upright, in the French style, her posture was one of prayerful dignity. She began to recite her final prayer. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The crowd held its breath, their eyes fixed on the swordsman. The executioner, to distract her, reportedly called out, "Where is my sword?" And as Anne's head turned slightly in response, he made his move. The blade, a flash of silver in the gray morning light, swung in a swift, silent arc. Her head was severed from her body in a single perfect stroke. What happened in the seconds immediately following the sword as a blow is the part of the story most often omitted, a detail that reveals the true, visceral horror of the event. According to multiple contemporary accounts, including that of the Imperial, ambassador's spy as the executioner held Anne's severed head aloft by its dark hair. Her eyes and lips were seen to move as if she were still trying to finish her prayer. This horrifying, reflexive muscular spasm, a final fleeting moment of neurological activity in the oxygen-starved brain, was interpreted by the terrified spectators as a sign of her unnatural, witch-like powers, or as a final ghostly protest from a woman unjustly killed. The sight was so disturbing that it sent a wave of shock and revulsion through the assembled crowd. It was a grotesque, unforgettable image that burned itself into the memory of all who saw it, a final, messy intrusion of biological reality into the carefully choreographed state ritual. The indignities continued even after this final, ghastly spectacle. In a final act of calculated disrespect, no proper coffin had been prepared for the former Queen of England. Her ladies, overcome with grief, had to fetch an old arrow chest from the Tower's armory. They gently lifted her severed head and her still warm body, wrapped them in a white cloth, and placed them into this crude, makeshift coffin. The woman for whom the kingdom had been torn asunder was given a burial container fit for discarded weaponry. She was hastily buried in an unmarked grave in the floor of the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the tower walls, a place reserved for executed traitors. She was laid to rest next to the headless body of her own brother, her name erased, her grave unceremonious, as if the state hoped she would be forgotten as quickly as she had been dispatched. But the state's attempt to control the narrative had, in this final moment, revealed its own profound cruelty. The arrow chest, the unmarked grave, the moving lips, these were the details. That could not be fully sanitized, the cracks in the facade of royal justice, through which the true horror of the event would continue to seep for centuries to come. The reaction of King Henry VIII to the news of his wife's death is perhaps the most chilling indictment of his character. He was not at the Tower. He had spent the morning hunting in the woods of Epping Forest. He was waiting for a signal. At the moment of Anne's death, a cannon was fired from the Tower, its boom echoing across the city and out into the countryside. When Henry heard the distant report, he reportedly cried out in triumph, "It is done! The deed is done! Uncouple the hounds, and let us follow the sport." He spent the rest of the day in boisterous celebration. At very evening, he was seen rowing down the Thames to the home of Jane Seymour, the woman for whom he had just murdered his wife. The next day, he and Jane were formally betrothed. Within 11 days of Anne's execution, they were married. This was not the behavior of a grieving husband who had been forced to execute a beloved but treasonous wife. This was the behavior of a man celebrating his liberation, a predator who, having finished with one meal, was moving on to the next. His callous, indecent haste reveals the entire affair for what it was: a judicially sanctioned murder to clear the way for a new marriage and the hope of a new heir. The personal had become brutally, murderously political. The psychological impact on the court was profound. Anne's execution created a climate of terror that would linger for the rest of Henry's reign. The speed and ruthlessness with which the Queen and some of the King's closest friends had been eliminated sent a clear and terrifying message. No one was safe. Loyalty was no guarantee of survival. A single word, a misplaced glance, could lead to the scaffold. Thomas Wyatt, the poet who had once admired Anne from afar, was himself a prisoner in the Tower during the executions. He witnessed the death of the 5 men from his cell window, and later wrote a powerful poem about the experience, lamenting the bloody and treacherous nature of the court he served. For the women of the court, particularly Anne's ladies-in-waiting, who were forced to attend her in her final moments and prepare her body for its crude burial, the trauma was immense. They had been participants in a state-sponsored horror show, their grief and terror necessarily suppressed under the watchful eyes of their captors. The execution of Anne Boleyn was not just the end of a queen. It was the birth of a new kind of tyranny, a regime built on a foundation of paranoia, where the king's will was absolute, and the law had become his personal instrument of vengeance. The ripple effects of this psychological trauma would shape the political and social landscape of England for years to come, a dark shadow cast by the events of that terrible May morning. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, Cromwell and the state machinery moved swiftly to control the narrative and erase Anne from history. This was a systematic campaign of damnatio memoria, the Roman practice of condemning a memory. Court painters were ordered to destroy her portraits. Her personal emblem, the white falcon, was chiseled off palace walls and replaced with the phoenix of Jane Seymour. Any documents or letters that presented her in a favorable light were suppressed or destroyed. An official, government-sanctioned narrative was promoted, one that painted Anne as a monstrous, promiscuous witch who had seduced the good king with sorcery, and whose death was a righteous act of divine and royal justice. The public was encouraged to believe this story. Sermons were preached from pulpits across the land, denouncing the concubine and praising the king's mercy and wisdom. This propaganda campaign was remarkably successful in the short term. For generations, the popular image of Anne Boleyn was that of a scheming adulteress who got what she deserved. But the erasure was never complete. The very brutality of her fall and the sensational nature of the charges against her ensured that her story would survive. Whispered in secret, recorded in the dispatches of foreign ambassadors, and preserved in the folk memory of the people, the most significant and ironic failure of Henry's attempt to erase her was, of course, the child she left behind. The young Princess Elizabeth, now officially a bastard and removed from the line of succession, was the living embodiment of everything Henry wanted to forget. She was sent away from court, her household reduced, her status uncertain. For a time, She was a political non-entity, a ghost of a failed marriage. But this child, the product of the union Henry had so violently renounced, would one day inherit his throne. And she would rule for over 40 years, becoming England's greatest monarch, her reign a golden age that would far eclipse the brutalities of her father's. In a final stunning act of historical irony, the daughter of the woman executed for failing to provide a male heir would prove to be a more capable, intelligent, and successful ruler than any son Henry could have ever dreamed of. The legacy of Anne Boleyn, the one Henry tried so desperately to extinguish, would ultimately define the future of the nation he ruled. Her reformist faith, her political acumen, her courage in the face of tyranny, all these qualities were inherited and magnified by her daughter. The bloodline Henry had sought to purify by spilling her blood would find its ultimate vindication in the child he had cast aside. From a modern psychological perspective, the fall of Anne Boleyn can be seen as a case study in institutional gaslighting and the psychopathology of a narcissistic tyrant. Henry VIII's behavior fits the classic pattern of a malignant narcissist: an inflated sense of self-importance, an insatiable need for admiration, a complete lack of empathy, and a terrifying rage when challenged or disappointed. His love for Anne was not love. It was possessive infatuation. He saw her as an extension of himself, a beautiful object that reflected his own glory. When she failed to fulfill her primary function, producing a male heir, she ceased to be a perfect reflection. She became a narcissistic injury, a flaw in his own narrative of greatness. And like any narcissist, he reacted to this injury not with sadness, but with a vengeful, annihilating fury. He had to destroy the source of his disappointment to preserve his own fragile ego. The state apparatus, under the control of Cromwell, became the instrument of this narcissistic rage. The accusations against Anne were a form of gaslighting on a massive scale. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation where a person or group is made to question their own sanity, memory, or perception of reality. Anne was presented with a version of her life that was a monstrous fiction, a narrative in which her innocent words were twisted into confessions of treason and her friendships into adulterous conspiracies. She was told this lie so relentlessly by so many figures of authority that she herself, in her moments of distress in the Tower, began to question her own memories, trying to find the kernel of truth in the mountain of falsehoods. This is the goal of gaslighting: to make the victim complicit in their own mental destruction. The trial was the public culmination of this process. It was a ritual designed not to find truth, but to ratify a pre-existing lie, to force the world to accept the king's new reality. The entire court, the jury of peers, the judges, they were all forced to participate in this collective act of gaslighting, to agree that the king's fiction was, in fact, reality. To do otherwise would be to risk their own lives. The legacy of Anne Boleyn's execution, therefore, transcends the story of a single wronged queen. It becomes a timeless parable about the nature of tyranny. It demonstrates how an authoritarian state, controlled by a narcissistic leader, can manipulate truth itself, turning law into a weapon, justice into a performance, and history into propaganda. Her story haunts us because it feels terrifyingly modern. In an age of alternative facts and information warfare, the systematic character assassination of Anne Boleyn serves as a chilling reminder of how easily reality can be rewritten by those in power, and how a lie, when repeated loudly enough by the state, can become the truth with deadly consequences for those who dare to stand in its way. The horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not just in the physical act of beheading, but in the comprehensive, systematic nature of her destruction. She was not merely killed. She was unmade. Her reputation as a virtuous woman was destroyed. Her status as a lawful queen was erased. Her marriage was invalidated. Her child was delegitimized. Her body was subjected to the ultimate indignity, and her memory was condemned. It was an act of total war, waged by a state against a single woman. Henry and Cromwell sought to create a historical black hole, a void where Anne Boleyn once stood. But in their very attempt to erase her, they created the conditions for her immortality. The sheer extremity of their cruelty, the lurid and unbelievable nature of the charges, the dignity with which she faced her end, all these factors ensured that her story would not die. Instead, it became a legend, a powerful narrative of martyrdom and injustice that would fascinate and horrify generations to come. The sanitized version of her death, the one that focuses on the mercy of the French swordsman, serves the narrative of the state. It allows us to see Henry as a complex, tragic figure, not as a monstrous tyrant. It turns a gruesome political murder into a sad royal romance. But the true story, the one found in the details of the show trial, the psychological torment in the tower, the moving lips on the severed head, and the crude arrow chest that served as her coffin, tells a different tale. It is a story that refuses to be sanitized. It is a story that confronts us with uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the construction of history. In the end, the most profound irony is that Anne Boleyn's greatest legacy was her death. It was in her fall that she became more than a queen. She became a symbol of female ambition crushed by a patriarchal world, a symbol of religious reform, a symbol of the terrifying power of a tyrannical state. She has become a canvas onto which we project our own ideas about justice, power, and truth. And that, perhaps, is her ultimate victory. Henry VIII, with all his absolute power, could take her life, but he could not control her story. It escaped his grasp, and it continues to haunt us, a chilling, eternal question about the true face of power and the price of defying it.